Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm down here on the floor today with my colleague, Senator Schatz from Hawaii, to talk about our recent introduction of a piece of legislation entitled the College Affordability and Innovation Act, which we introduced along with our good friends, Senator Murray of Washington and Senator Sanders of Vermont. And by way of framing the conversation that we'll have today, Madam President, I want to talk about one particular college that maybe paints a picture of the crisis that we are in today with respect to the mounting cost that confronts kids and families when they want to get a college education, and the variety of outcomes, the frankly surprising and often shocking variety of outcomes that students are getting when they show up at the doors of institutions of institutions of education, particularly institutions of for-profit education. Corinthian College is a college in California. It's not a small college, it's a pretty big college. It's got about 100 campuses on 25 different states. Let me give you some statistics about Corinthian College. After about a year, over half of the students who enroll drop out. When they're finished with their education, whether it be to a degree or not, about 1/3 of all students who go to Corinthian default on their student loans. If 56% isn't a bad enough number in terms of one-year dropout rates, after 4 years, only 6% of all the kids that walk in through the doors of Corinthian College get a degree. 6% of those kids. And affordability isn't an argument in favor of this school either. For a legal assistant degree, they charge $28,000, but down the street at a community college, you could get that same degree for $2,500. 35% default rate, 6% four-year graduation rate, degrees that can cost 14 times as much as comparable local schools. And guess what? The federal government rewards this school with $1.6 billion in federal aid every year and $500 million, in Pell Grant money every year. And so this example, which frankly can be repeated over and over again, especially in the for-profit world, speaks to the challenge that we have. We have done a really credible job over the course of the last few years in keeping down the interest rate that we charge students who want to take out loans to go to school. And no one has worked harder on this issue inside this body and outside this body than the presiding officer. But we also have to have a concurrent conversation about the sticker price of college, because it can't be enough that we are facilitating student borrowing. We actually have to try to engage in a real effort using federal levers for the first time perhaps in our history of federal higher education policy to push the cost of tuition down in the first place. And that's what the College Affordability and Innovation Act seeks to do. As Senator Schatz will talk about, there aren't a lot of issues that are much more important to the middle class than the cost of a higher education. And we both know that. We've partnered on this piece of legislation in part because not only are we not that far away from the time in our lives when we were in college, but we are paying back our student loans and saving for our kids' education. So we get how much of an annual budget can be taken up in paying for both prior and saving for future college. And so we attack this problem in two ways. And I'll just briefly talk about the first way, and then I think the senator from Hawaii can talk a little bit about the second method. First, we think that it's time for a little bit more innovation when it comes to the way in which colleges structure a degree. There's really no magic to the fact that today you have to sit in a classroom for 4 years, taking a requisite amount of credits in order to get a degree. And there's a lot of interesting innovation happening out there where a small subset of schools are saying, wait a second, maybe there's a different way to do it. For instance, maybe we should award a degree based on the competencies you get, regardless of whether you need 2 years or 3 years or 4 years to get that degree. Or, for instance, maybe we should give students who show up at their freshman year of school with prior learning more credit for that, whether you got that experience studying at a high school or in the workforce or in the military. some students don't have to start as a freshman. Some students can start as a sophomore or a junior. Or maybe it's a renewed effort to consolidate graduate programs with undergraduate programs. I think President Obama is right. You don't need 7 years to become a lawyer in this country. It doesn't make a lot of sense that you got to essentially spend 10 to 15 years in education and training to become a doctor. We can consolidate graduate and undergraduate programs. But whatever we do, we have to admit that one of the easiest ways to reduce the cost of a degree is to reduce the time that it takes to get a degree. And so the first part of our bill focuses on giving some grants to a small number of schools to build out the right way to do competency-based degree programming or initiatives to give greater credit for prior learning or consolidations of graduate and undergraduate degrees. We introduced this piece of legislation because we think it's time to start having a real conversation about what the federal government can do to control and lower the price of college education. It's breaking the bank for families, and we can do something about it. If we didn't have any tools at our disposal, maybe this wouldn't be a worthwhile conversation. But we give out $140 billion in federal aid every year, and it's about time that we start demanding some accountability for that money, whether it's accountability for cost or accountability for quality. It doesn't make sense for taxpayers to be sending $1.6 billion a year to a school with a 6% graduation rate, a 38% loan default rate, and prices that are simply not competitive in the landscape of college education. So I'm pleased to be down here on the floor with my colleague, Senator Schatz, and happy to turn the floor over to him.
Well, I thank the senator from Connecticut for his partnership on this legislation. He's been a real friend and a true partner on this legislation. We're happy to have the support of Senator Murray from Washington and Senator Sanders, who have been working on this issue for a long time. But this really is the middle-class issue of our time. And it doesn't just belong to college-age students. It belongs to all of us. Senator Murphy talked about how important it is for those of us who have young children and are beginning the process of trying to save up for our children's college education. But it also belongs to the grandparents' generation. So many people are thinking about whether they can help their kids to ameliorate their existing student loans or their grandkids to be able to afford college. As Senator Murphy mentioned, we spend almost $150 billion in some form or fashion on federal financial aid for institutions of higher learning, and that's a good thing. That is a matter of national strategy. That is about the American dream. That is about the premise that the president talked about in his State of the Union, which is that if you work hard and you play by the rules, that you can move up the economic ladder. And higher education is one of the best ways to do that. It always has been in the United States of America. But here's the problem. And the senator from Connecticut talked about an individual example, but let me give you the aggregate data. Over the last 10 years, we have spent 20% more, and we have gotten 25% less. We are spending 20% more, and we are getting 25% less. That means that although our investment in higher education and theoretically in college affordability has increased, the net cost for students has gone up by 25%. We now have more than $1 trillion in student loan debt. It's the second largest source of debt to mortgage interest debt. It has now outpaced credit card debt. This is a real crisis, not just on the consumer level, but as a matter of economic strategy for our nation, because to the degree and extent that young people or people who want retraining or people who want to get a culinary degree or become a master carpenter or become an architect or a doctor start to evaluate higher education and decide that it's not a good value anymore, that doesn't just impact their individual family or their individual community, but it impacts our national economic strategy. College is no longer affordable for many, many people, and that's despite the fact that we are spending more in raw dollars and in inflation-adjusted dollars than ever before. Senator Murphy talked about the innovation portion of this legislation. We also have an accountability portion of this legislation. Here's the basic premise. As an institution of higher education, if you're a for-profit, if you're a not-for-profit, or even if you're a public institution, it's not the federal government's job to determine what your mission may be. And certainly if you're a private for-profit, we're not here to dictate your organization's mission. But a for-profit institution has no special right to federal funding. And if you're going to receive billions of dollars in federal subsidies, we think it's reasonable, as we endeavor to reauthorize the Higher Education Act, that we tie some reasonable public policy strings to those dollars. And all we are saying is that we want institutions of higher learnings, and especially their leadership, to wake up every morning and think not first about profits, not think first about how they're going to market to find more customers, but think about access and affordability. And what we're saying is that different institutions may have different missions. A community college has a different mission from a training institute, and a four-year institution has a different mission than a graduate institution. And that's all fine, and that's why we've established in this legislation an independent commission comprised of experts to determine what matrix of incentives and possible penalties would be appropriate for each institution. But here's the bottom line. We are spending more and getting less, and we are spending $150 billion. This system is not working, and we're pleased to have the support of several of our colleagues. We're going to be enlisting the support of many others, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with the senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Here's another statistic to think about. It wasn't so long ago where we ranked first in the nation with respect to 25-year-olds to 35-year-olds with college degrees, and that was not only a source of immense pride for this country, but really the genesis of our economic greatness, that we just turned out more college-educated young people than any other country in the world. In a very short period of time, we have slipped from first to not second or third or fourth, but to 12th. We are now 12th in the world with respect to the number of 25 to 35-year-olds with college degrees. Now, part of the reason for that is that a lot of other colleges, a lot of other countries have caught up to the United States. But the crisis in this country is no longer just a crisis of access. That was the buzzword for a long time, that we needed to increase access to college. We now have a crisis of completion, in which millions of students are starting school and not finishing it for a variety of reasons, but largely because of the astronomical cost. Today, the majority of students are not graduating in 6 years. And so the issue about affordability is not just about attracting more kids into the doors of college, because I'll tell you, as I'm sure you do, Senator Schatz, I talk to a lot of kids who graduate high school and don't apply to school in my state because they are scared off by the cost, and they just don't believe that they're going to be able to put together the family resource to pay for it. But we also are losing a generation of workers because it's taking young people now 6, 7, 8 years to complete a degree. And often, many of them are never completing that degree while still taking on loan after loan after loan and getting stuck in the worst possible situation, whereby they have thousands of dollars in debt and no certificate to bring into the workforce. And so, our effort here is an effort to address cost because we care about access, but it's also an effort to address cost because we care about completion, and that's one of the big problems that we have in our system today.
Well, I think you're exactly right about that one. Let me give you some data on, in 2011, only 38% of undergraduate students in a four-year institution graduated on time. And so when you think about the cost of college, you think about the per year cost. But if it's taking 6 or 7 years, then the per year cost is not as important as how realistic it is for you to finish on time. And this isn't, just to be clear, those data could be skewed by the fact that there are part-time students and all the rest of it. That's not what we're talking about here. It is simply hard to finish on time, but there is hope on the horizon. For instance, the University of Hawaii has undertaken a program called 15 to Finish. And the basic idea is that students, especially in their freshman year, need to know that they need those 15 credits. They need to get help from their counselors so that by the time they're in their sophomore year, they are well on their way to completing their major of choice in their four-year period of time. The challenge now is that given that legislatures have cut funding to institutions of higher learning, And as a result, you have fewer counselors and fewer people to assist in the student services office. Oftentimes, you don't get real counseling with respect to what you need until it's too late. And then you find that you're on a 5 or 6 year plan. Your family may not have made the financial arrangements that put you in a position to be on the 5-year plan, which means that now, from a revenue standpoint, if your mission as an institution, for-profit or not-for-profit, is just to fill those seats and to generate those dollars, then that doesn't matter to you. But the challenge we have right now is that the institutions have, the publicly traded ones have pressures to generate profits, but even the not-for-profits and even the public institutions, the universities of Hawaii and the University of Connecticut, have had their funding reduced by the legislatures. And so their CFOs are trying to figure out new revenue streams, and as long as they can keep enrollment up, that enables them to go back to their legislature and say, we're in the black. And what we're saying is that that's not good enough. We're not asking you to be in the black. We certainly understand the need to be fiscally responsible. We certainly understand the need to generate tuition revenue. But here's the thing. The point of higher education is for students to be able to move up that economic ladder. And to the extent that not only is it not accomplishing that goal, but it's actually doing the opposite for some of our students. They end up with a mountain of debt and either no degree or a degree that they find doesn't make them employable in the marketplace. That is a national shame. And that's why we have to address this. The good news is that we believe that we are spending a sufficient amount of money on the federal level so that we can effectuate these changes just by saying, if you want to receive federal dollars for your institution of higher learning, then we are asking you to focus on access and affordability. I want to give you one last piece of data because it actually shocked me, even as much as I've been working on this issue. The for-profit institutions comprise about 12% of the students and 30% of the federal dollars. 12% of the students and 30% of the federal dollars. And so while there are institutions that are for-profit that are doing great work, and there are not-for-profits and public institutions that have to do a lot better, let's call it like it is. One of the major challenges here is we have to wrap our arms around undue profits and publicly traded companies that are generating profits and spending federal dollars on marketing to students and not providing very much in the way of value.
And I think let's be clear about what we're talking about here. We believe we're talking about a pretty light hand of accountability, in the sense that we are really going after the true outliers. You talked about the work happening at the University of Hawaii or the University of Connecticut. We don't imagine that any flagship university is going to run afoul of these accountability standards. I frankly don't believe many public universities at all are going to run afoul of these standards. We're really talking about the handful of outliers that have just absolutely abysmal retention rates, graduation rates, default rates, or tuition increase rates. And we're also talking about, we think, a pretty nuanced process by which to try to bring those schools around before they would lose eligibility for funding. Our bill says that if you're not meeting these standards, you'd have a pretty long period of time in which you'd be on probation with no practical effects, in which you could set upon an action plan to improve your affordability or outcomes. And then if after that period of time you still weren't hitting your benchmarks, then you'd lose 10% of your federal aid, then 20%, and then finally in the 4th or 5th year is when you would become ineligible. That's plenty of time for a university to correct. But if a school that's starting out with a 6% graduation rate can't improve that over 5 years, why on earth would we continue to send $1 billion to that school when it could be used for students who are attending schools that care a lot more about quality education?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And we had the senator from Indiana talking about debt and deficits and making sure that we spend every federal dollar intelligently. And right now, we're simply not spending this money in the most efficient and efficacious way possible. And that's what this legislation is about. It actually, Senator Murphy and I talked about how it might have been a little more politically satisfying in the short run to put hard caps on college tuition and precipitous goals that would have been very easy for us to articulate. But the fact is, given that you have different institutions with different missions and you have great work being done at a community college level, at the certificate level, and at the and at the four-year and at the graduate level, that we wanted to account for the different missions, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't create the kind of incentive program that, for instance, would prevent an institution from wanting to take a kid in who's from a lower income area and may be, statistically speaking, more likely to default on his or her loan. And we really want, as a matter of policy, to focus on access. So it's access, it's affordability, it's the consistency with the mission. But here we are spending $150 billion more than we ever have on this national priority, and our results are worse than ever. And so the status quo cannot stand, and I'm really looking forward to working with my colleague on this important issue.
As we wrap up our time on the floor here, when my great-grandfather came to this country, he knew that without a college education, he could get a job pretty easily that would be able to put food on the table, have decent health care for his family, even provide him with a little bit of a pension that would take care of him. And his son, my grandfather, followed him into that same profession, working for a ball bearing factory in New Britain, Connecticut. Now, while those jobs still exist, they are getting rarer and rarer. And for the next generation to succeed, we know they need access to a college degree. They're not getting that access to completion because we have been woefully inadequate in using the tools at our disposal at the federal level to try to put pressure on colleges to deliver on both affordability and outcomes. And we hope that the introduction of the College Affordability and Innovation Act will allow us to open up a new front in the debate on higher education to promote the idea of reducing the sticker price of college. I thank my colleague for joining me, and I yield the floor.